Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey, dear friends.
Medieval sex was not rare, it was everywhere. Duty and silence. What looks like a strict and moral world begins to shift the moment you look closer, revealing marriages without love, desire without freedom, and rules that never truly stopped anything. Beneath the surface, people lived double lives, balancing expectation with instinct in ways that feel strangely familiar. Tonight, you step into a world where nothing is exactly as you imagined and everything feels closer than it should. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you imagine medieval sex as something distant, rare, and tightly controlled, then the picture forming in your mind is already misleading. It feels natural to assume that a society shaped so heavily by religion would leave little room for desire. That people lived in a world where rules were followed closely and personal impulses were kept in check. This idea creates a sense of order, as if everything were clearly defined and carefully maintained. It suggests a life where intimacy was limited, quiet, and perhaps even unimportant in the larger structure of daily survival. This belief is not entirely without reason. Much of what remains from the Middle Ages comes from official voices, from religious teachings, legal codes, and written expectations about how people should behave. These sources speak with authority. They describe what is allowed and what is forbidden, often in clear and uncompromising terms. When these voices are taken at face value, they give the impression of a world that functioned exactly as instructed, where individuals followed a strict moral path without deviation. But human life rarely fits neatly into what is written. Behind every rule, there is behavior that bends around it. Behind every expectation, some individuals interpret it in their own way. The Middle Ages were no different. Beneath the surface of sermons and laws, people continued to live complex lives, shaped not only by duty, but also by need, curiosity, and desire. The difference was not that these feelings were absent, but that they existed under pressure. This pressure came from many directions. Reputation mattered deeply in medieval communities, where one's standing could affect not just personal life but also family stability and future opportunities. Religious expectations added another layer, reminding individuals of sin, judgment, and consequence. Together, these forces created a system where behavior was constantly observed, either by others or by one's own conscience. It encouraged outward control, but it could not eliminate inner experience. As a result, a gap formed between what was visible and what was real. Publicly, people appeared to follow the rules. Privately, they navigated their own realities. This gap is not always obvious in traditional records, but it appears in fragments. Court documents reveal disputes that expose hidden relationships. Confessions hint at thoughts and actions that contradict official teachings. Stories and shared knowledge suggest that people were far more aware of these matters than the formal tone of the time would suggest. The more these fragments are considered together, the more the simple image begins to break apart. Medieval society was not defined by the absence of sexuality, but by the way it was structured and controlled. Desire did not disappear. It adapted. It moved into quieter spaces, expressed itself in indirect ways, and continued to exist even when it was not openly acknowledged. Understanding this requires stepping away from modern expectations. Today, discussions about intimacy are often open, personal, and tied to individual choice. In contrast, medieval life placed intimacy within a network of responsibilities. It was connected to family, to property, to social order. It was not simply about two individuals, but about how those individuals fit into a larger system. This changed how people approached it, how they understood it, and how they spoke about it. Living conditions also played a role in shaping these experiences. Many households were crowded, with multiple generations sharing limited space. Privacy was minimal, and daily life unfolded in proximity to others. This meant that even the most personal moments were influenced by the presence of the surrounding environment. Intimacy did not occur in isolation, but within the rhythms of shared living. It required awareness, timing, and often a degree of quiet adaptation. Knowledge of the body further added to the complexity. Without modern scientific understanding, people relied on inherited beliefs and observations. Some ideas acknowledged that both men and women experienced desire, while others framed intimacy primarily in terms of reproduction. These perspectives did not always align, creating a mixture of acceptance and restriction. The body was both recognized and controlled, understood and limited at the same time. What is most striking is how familiar this contradiction feels when examined closely. The difference lies not in the presence of desire, but in how it was handled. Medieval people were no less human. They faced the same internal experiences, but within a system that demanded restraint and offered limited space for personal expression. This created a constant negotiation between what was expected and what was felt. Even authority, which appears strong in written records, had practical limits. Religious teachings could guide behavior, but they could not fully control it. Individuals still made choices, and communities developed their own ways of responding to situations that did not fit neatly within official rules. This meant that life was shaped not only by what was written, but by how people lived within and around those instructions. The more one looks beyond the surface, the clearer it becomes that the Middle Ages were not a world of silence, but a world of quiet complexity. It was a place where desire existed alongside restriction, where rules were followed and bent at the same time. It was not a simple story of control, but a layered reality where human behavior continued despite the structures placed around it.
This is what makes the subject unsettling.
It challenges the comfortable assumption that the past was simpler or more controlled. Instead, it reveals a world that is both distant and strangely familiar, a world where people lived with the same impulses, but under conditions that forced those impulses into less visible forms.
What seems at first like a world without desire is actually one where desire never disappeared.
It only learned to exist in silence beneath the surface.
As that silence begins to break, it leads directly into the structure that people trusted the most to control it.
Because what comes next is not about freedom or romance, but about how marriage itself turned intimacy into something that had to happen even when there was no desire at all. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not something that began with a feeling. It began with an agreement. In most cases, that agreement was shaped long before the individuals involved had any real say in it. Families arranged marriages based on land, alliances, and the need to secure their position within a larger social structure.
A union was not simply about two people deciding to share a life.
It was about ensuring that property stayed within certain lines, that relationships between families remained stable, and that future generations would continue that order. This meant that the foundation of marriage was not built on personal connection. It was built on expectation. The husband and wife entered the relationship with roles already defined for them. These roles did not come from within the relationship itself. They came from the outside, from the demands of family, community, and tradition.
The couple did not create the structure.
They stepped into it. Within this structure, intimacy was not seen as something to be discovered or developed over time. It was treated as something that needed to happen.
It was part of what made the marriage complete.
The physical relationship between husband and wife was not only expected, but it was also required. It was tied directly to the purpose of the union, which was to produce children and continue the family line. This purpose shaped how intimacy was understood and experienced. The absence of personal choice at the beginning made this even more complex. Many couples entered marriage without having spent significant time together. They did not have the opportunity to build familiarity or comfort in the way modern relationships often do. Instead, they moved directly from arrangement to expectation. This created a situation where intimacy was introduced not as a gradual process, but as an immediate obligation. The first night of marriage carried the full weight of this expectation. It was not approached as a private moment between two individuals discovering each other. It was seen as a necessary step that had to be completed. In some cases, there was an unspoken awareness from others in the household, a sense that this moment was being indirectly observed or anticipated. Privacy existed, but it was limited by the environment and by the knowledge that the outcome of that night mattered beyond the couple themselves. For many women, this moment was defined by uncertainty. Their understanding of their own bodies was often shaped by warnings, not by explanation. The experience was not framed as something to explore or enjoy. It was framed as something that had to be endured, something that marked the transition into a new role. For men, there was a different kind of pressure. They were expected to perform their role correctly and without hesitation to confirm their place within the structure of the marriage. Both individuals were guided more by expectation than by personal readiness. This dynamic continued beyond the first night. Intimacy within marriage was expected to occur regularly, not because of emotional connection, but because it served a clear function. That function was reproduction. Each encounter was understood in relation to the possibility of creating children. Even when desire existed, it was shaped by this expectation. It was not treated as something separate from duty. It was absorbed into it. The environment in which couples lived reinforced this sense of obligation.
Many households were shared spaces where privacy was limited and daily life unfolded in proximity to others. There were often multiple people under one roof, including family members, servants, or workers. This meant that intimacy had to exist within a setting that was not entirely private. It required awareness and adaptation, turning something deeply personal into something that was carefully managed within a shared space. Religious influence added another layer to this structure. There were specific times when intimacy was discouraged or restricted based on religious calendars and teachings. This meant that even within marriage, the couple did not have full control over their own relationship. Their private life was shaped by external rules that defined when it was appropriate to act and when it was not. Intimacy was not just a matter of personal decision. It was part of a broader system of order. Despite these constraints, human emotion did not disappear. Some couples found ways to build understanding over time, developing a form of connection that allowed them to navigate their situation more comfortably. But this was not guaranteed. The system itself did not prioritize emotional closeness. It prioritized stability, continuity, and the fulfillment of roles. Any deeper connection had to emerge within those limits. What makes this difficult to fully grasp is how different it is from modern expectations. Today, relationships are often built around mutual choice, communication, and shared desire. In contrast, medieval marriage treated intimacy as something that had to happen regardless of feeling. It was closer to a responsibility than a shared experience. It was something embedded within daily life, shaped by expectation rather than guided by personal preference. The more closely this structure is examined, the clearer it becomes that marriage was not designed to create comfort. It was designed to maintain order. The couple existed within that design, moving through it as best they could. Their personal experiences were real, but they were shaped by forces that extended far beyond them. This is what gives medieval marriage its weight. It was not simply a personal bond. It was a part of a larger system that controlled behavior and defined roles. Intimacy within this system was not free. It was directed, expected, and often detached from individual desire. Marriage in the Middle Ages was built on obligation rather than feeling, turning intimacy into something that had to be fulfilled instead of something that was freely shared. As this system tried to contain and direct human behavior, it revealed its own limitations. What comes next is not about how well these rules worked, but about how even the church could not fully control what people continued to do in private. The authority of the church in the Middle Ages appears overwhelming when viewed from a distance. Its teachings shaped laws, guided behavior, and defined what was considered right and wrong in nearly every aspect of life. Sermons repeated the same expectations, reinforcing the idea that moral order could be maintained if people followed what they were told. It created the impression of a system that reached into every home, every relationship, and every private moment, leaving little room for deviation. But authority, no matter how strong it appears, has limits when it meets human behavior. The church could define rules, but it could not fully control how those rules were lived. Behind closed doors, individuals continued to make decisions shaped by their own needs, fears, and circumstances. These decisions did not always align with what was preached. This created a quiet but constant gap between instruction and reality. Religious teachings about relationships were detailed and specific. They outlined when intimacy was acceptable, when it was considered sinful, and under what conditions it should occur. These rules were not vague suggestions. They were presented as part of a moral structure that people were expected to follow closely. The idea was that by controlling behavior, order could be preserved and spiritual well-being could be protected. In practice, however, daily life was far more complicated. People lived in environments where strict adherence to these rules was not always possible. Marriage, as already shaped by obligation, did not guarantee emotional connection. Desire did not disappear simply because it was restricted. Instead, it continued to exist in ways that were less visible, often adapted to fit within or around the boundaries that had been set. This is where the difference between what was taught and what was done becomes most apparent. The church spoke openly about sin, but individuals navigated their own realities quietly. They made compromises, justified their actions, and developed ways of living that allowed them to balance expectation with experience. These choices rarely appeared straightforwardly in official records, but traces of them remain. Confession offers one of the clearest glimpses into this hidden world. Individuals were expected to confess their sins, to speak openly about actions and thoughts that went against religious teaching. While this system was meant to enforce control, it also revealed how often those rules were not followed. The range of confession shows a reality far more active and complex than the formal teachings would suggest. It becomes clear that people were not simply obeying. They were struggling, negotiating, and often failing to meet the standards set for them.
The existence of these confessions highlights something important. It shows that behavior did not stop at the boundary of what was allowed. It continued beyond it. The church could respond to these actions through guidance or punishment, but it could not prevent them entirely. This created a cycle where rules were established, broken, confessed, and then repeated again. Community life also played a role in shaping this gap. People lived closely with one another, aware of each other's reputations and actions. This created pressure to appear compliant even when reality was different. Public behavior often reflected what was expected, while private behavior reflected what was actually lived. The result was a kind of dual existence, where individuals maintained one version of themselves for the community and another for their own private lives. This duality was not always deliberate. In many cases, it was simply the result of living within a system that could not fully account for human complexity. People were not constantly rebelling against authority, but they were not perfectly following it either. They moved within the system, adjusting their behavior as needed, sometimes aligning with expectations and sometimes moving away from them. Even within religious institutions themselves, this gap could be observed. Monasteries and other religious communities were meant to represent a life of discipline and separation from worldly concerns. Yet records and accounts suggest that they were not entirely removed from the same pattern seen in wider society. This does not diminish the role of the church, but it does show that no system can fully remove human behavior from its influence. What makes this particularly striking is how it contrasts with modern assumptions. It is easy to imagine that strong authority leads to strict compliance, but history shows that compliance is often partial. Rules influence behavior, but they do not define it completely. People continue to act in ways that reflect their own experiences, even within systems designed to guide them. The Middle Ages were not a time when individuals lived in perfect alignment with religious teaching. They were a time when individuals lived under that teaching, responding to it in ways that were shaped by their own realities. This created a society where appearance and reality did not always match, where what was spoken publicly differed from what was lived privately. Understanding this helps to reveal the true nature of the period. It was not a world of complete control, but a world of ongoing negotiation between authority and human behavior. The church defined the structure, but individuals filled that structure with actions that did not always follow the intended design. As this gap becomes clearer, it changes how the entire subject is viewed. It is no longer a story of restriction alone. It becomes a story of how people lived within restriction, how they adapted to it, and how they continued to express parts of themselves even when those parts were not fully accepted. The church could define what was right and wrong, but it could not fully control what people continued to do once they were out of sight. As this gap between rule and reality widens, it begins to expose something far more unsettling beneath the surface. What comes next is not about control at all, but about how a society that tried to suppress desire ended up becoming deeply obsessed with it in ways that were impossible to ignore. The more closely the Middle Ages are examined, the clearer it becomes that restriction did not erase desire. It reshaped how it appeared. From a distance, the period looks defined by control, by rules that aim to limit behavior and maintain order. It is easy to assume that such a system would reduce the presence of intimacy in daily life. What emerges instead is something far more complex. The very act of restriction created a constant awareness of what was being restricted. When a subject is placed under continuous scrutiny, it does not disappear. It becomes more noticeable. It begins to appear in places where it is not expected, carried through indirect forms that allow it to exist without openly challenging authority. In medieval society, this process can be seen in the way people spoke, recorded, and even joked about matters that were supposed to remain controlled. The surface remained orderly, but beneath it there was constant movement. Religious teaching played a central role in this dynamic. Defining what was considered acceptable and what was not created a framework that required continuous attention. Individuals were expected to monitor their thoughts and actions, to recognize when they had crossed a boundary and to seek correction through confession. This process kept the subject present in the mind even when it was not openly discussed. It turned private experience into something that had to be examined, remembered, and repeated in a structured way. Confession in particular reveals how persistent this awareness was. People were not only expected to admit actions, but also to reflect on thoughts, intentions, and temptations. This meant that even moments that did not result in visible behavior were still considered significant. The act of confessing required individuals to revisit these experiences, to describe them, and to place them within a moral framework. In doing so, it ensured that the subject remained active in their consciousness. Beyond religious settings, this awareness continued in everyday life. Stories circulated within communities, often carrying meanings that were understood without being stated directly. Humor became one of the ways in which sensitive topics could be approached without openly confronting them. Jokes allowed people to acknowledge shared understanding while maintaining the appearance of distance. In these forms, the subject was not absent. It was present in a way that could be managed. Rumors also played a role in maintaining this constant attention. In closely connected communities, information moved quickly, often blending truth and speculation. Stories about relationships, behavior, and private actions spread from one person to another, creating a shared awareness that extended beyond direct observation. This did not mean that everything was known, but it did mean that the subject was never entirely hidden. It existed within the network of communication that shaped daily life. What makes this particularly striking is how it contrasts with the idea of suppression. Suppression suggests removal, an absence created by strict control. But what appears instead is concentration. The subject did not disappear. It gathered within specific channels, becoming more defined in the process. It was shaped by the rules that attempted to limit it, taking on forms that allowed it to continue within those limits. The physical environment added another layer to this pattern. Living conditions often placed individuals in proximity to one another, reducing the separation between public and private life. This created a situation where behavior could be observed indirectly, where awareness of others was constant, and where personal actions were never entirely isolated. In such an environment, attention naturally increased. The boundaries between what was known and what was assumed became less clear. Even the language used during the period reflects this tension. Direct expression was often avoided in formal contexts, but indirect references were common. Descriptions, metaphors, and coded language allowed people to communicate ideas without stating them openly. This created a shared understanding that existed beneath the surface of official discourse. It allowed the subject to remain present while still appearing controlled. Over time, this combination of restriction and indirect expression created a culture where the subject was both hidden and constantly present. It was not discussed openly in the same way as other aspects of life, but it was never fully absent from thought or conversation. It existed in a state of partial visibility, shaped by the need to remain within acceptable boundaries. This is what makes the Middle Ages difficult to interpret through a modern lens. The expectation that restriction leads to absence does not hold. Instead, restriction leads to transformation. It changes how something appears, where it is expressed, and how it is understood. It creates layers that must be carefully examined to see what lies beneath. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes that the period was not defined by a lack of desire, but by the way desire was managed. It was contained, redirected, and often disguised, but it continued to exist. It influenced behavior, shaped communication, and remained a constant presence within the structure of daily life. This creates a sense of tension that runs through the entire period. On one side, there is the appearance of control reinforced by rules and expectations. On the other hand, there is the persistence of human experience, moving through those rules in ways that are not always visible. The interaction between these two sides defines much of what is seen. What appears at first to be a tightly controlled world is actually one where attention to desire never fades. It only shifts into quieter and more indirect forms. As this attention grows, it begins to reveal something that cannot be fully contained by rules alone. The next layer is not about how often desire was present, but about how it was forced into spaces where it became heavier, more physical, and far less romantic than modern imagination would suggest. A wedding night in the Middle Ages was not shaped by curiosity or tenderness. It unfolded under expectation, where something arranged in public had to be completed in private. Once the ceremony ended, attention moved quickly away from celebration and toward confirmation. The union was not considered fully real until it had been physically carried out, and this understanding placed an immediate weight on both individuals involved. What might be imagined today as a quiet beginning was in reality a moment already defined before it began. For many women, this moment arrived without a clear sense of what it would involve. Knowledge about the body was often limited, shaped by fragments of information rather than open explanation. Preparation did not come through understanding, but through warning. The transition into marriage was not gradual. It was sudden, marked by the expectation that something specific had to happen, regardless of personal readiness. This created a sense of unease that settled in even before the night began. The pressure placed on the bride extended beyond her own experience. Her body was tied to ideas of honor that belonged not just to her, but to her entire family. What happened during that night could affect how she was seen by others, influencing her reputation in ways that were difficult to reverse. This meant that the moment carried consequences that reached far beyond the room in which it took place. It turned something deeply personal into something connected to social standing. For the groom, the situation carried its own expectations. He was expected to act with certainty, to complete what was required, and to demonstrate that the marriage had been fulfilled. This was not simply about the relationship itself. It was connected to ideas of authority and capability that shaped how he would be perceived. There was little room for hesitation, and the expectation of success created its own form of pressure. The environment in which this moment occurred made it even more complex. Many homes did not provide true privacy. Space was limited, and others were often nearby, aware of what was expected to take place. Even without direct observation, the presence of others could be felt. This awareness made it difficult for the couple to experience the moment as something entirely their own. It existed within a shared environment where personal boundaries were not fully separated from daily life. In some cases, there was an expectation that the outcome would be known. The confirmation of the bride's virginity could become a matter of discussion or evidence, depending on local customs. While not every situation involved direct verification, the possibility alone influenced how the night was approached. It reinforced the idea that the moment was not entirely private, but part of a larger system concerned with legitimacy and inheritance. The physical experience itself was often shaped by this lack of preparation. Without a clear understanding or communication, the encounter could be uncomfortable or even painful. This was not necessarily treated as unusual. It was often accepted as part of the process, something that accompanied the transition into marriage. The focus remained on completion rather than comfort, on fulfilling expectation rather than creating a shared experience. What stands out most is the absence of negotiation. Modern perspectives often emphasize communication and mutual readiness. In contrast, medieval marriage created a situation where expectation replaced discussion. The act itself was considered part of the agreement, not something that required separate consideration. This changed how the moment was experienced, turning it into something that had to happen rather than something that could be approached gradually. The involvement of family, even indirectly, added to this pressure. The outcome of the night was tied to future expectations, particularly the production of children. This extended the significance of the moment beyond the individuals themselves. It became a step within a larger process, one that connected personal experience to social structure. The couple was at the center of this process, but they were not in control of its meaning. Despite these conditions, not every experience followed the same pattern. Some couples adjusted over time, finding ways to build understanding within the limits they faced. But this was not something guaranteed by the system. It was something that developed despite it. The structure itself did not encourage patience or exploration. It required completion, often without regard for how that completion felt. The contrast between expectation and experience is what defines this moment. It is often imagined as a beginning filled with closeness and discovery. In reality, it was frequently marked by pressure, uncertainty, and the need to meet external demands. The emotional and physical aspects were shaped by forces that extended beyond the individuals involved, leaving little space for personal comfort. This moment reflects a broader pattern within medieval life. Personal experiences were often shaped by systems that prioritized order over individual feeling. What might be considered private in one context became part of a larger structure in another. The wedding night is one of the clearest examples of this, where the personal and the social became inseparable. A wedding night in the Middle Ages was not a gentle beginning but a moment defined by pressure, where expectation mattered more than comfort and proof mattered more than feeling. As that pressure did not end with a single night, it continued to shape how individuals were judged and controlled. What follows reveals how a woman's body itself became something monitored, valued, and treated as part of a larger system rather than something that belonged only to her. Virginity in the Middle Ages was not understood as a private condition. It was treated as something that carried visible value, something that could influence how an entire family was judged. A young woman's body became closely tied to ideas of honor, not only her own, but that of those around her. What might seem like a personal matter in another context was in this setting part of a broader system that connected reputation, trust, and social standing. This connection did not exist abstractly. It shaped behavior, expectations, and decisions long before marriage even took place.
Families monitored their daughters carefully, not only out of concern for morality, but because of what was at stake. A single accusation, even without proof, could damage a family's reputation in ways that were difficult to repair. In closely connected communities, where information moved quickly and memory was long, such damage could affect future opportunities, alliances, and security. The body of a young woman was therefore not treated as something entirely her own. It was seen as something that had to be protected, managed, and preserved for a specific purpose. That purpose was marriage. More precisely, it was the ability to enter marriage with a status that confirmed legitimacy and stability. Virginity became a kind of guarantee, a sign that the family had maintained control and that the future union would be free from doubt. This transformed intimacy before marriage into something far more serious than a personal decision. It was not simply about two individuals acting on their feelings. It was about the potential consequences that extended beyond them. If a relationship became known or even suspected, it could affect how the woman was viewed, how her family was treated, and whether a future marriage would be possible. The risk was not only emotional, it was social and economic. What makes this system particularly striking is how it framed responsibility. The burden of maintaining this form of honor fell heavily on women. Their actions were observed more closely, judged more strictly, and remembered more clearly. While men were not entirely free from expectation, the consequences they faced were often less severe or more easily overlooked. This created an imbalance that shaped how behavior was understood and responded to within the community. Control extended into daily life in ways that were both visible and subtle. Movement could be restricted, interactions monitored, and opportunities for privacy limited. Families created environments that reduced the possibility of unsupervised contact, reinforcing the idea that protection required constant attention. These measures were not always presented as control. They were often framed as care, as necessary steps to ensure safety and preserve future stability. At the same time, the system relied heavily on perception. What others believed could matter as much as what actually happened. Rumors, once spread, could become difficult to challenge, especially in communities where reputation was built over long periods. This meant that even the appearance of impropriety could carry consequences. The need to maintain a certain image became as important as maintaining reality itself. This emphasis on perception reveals another layer of the system. Virginity was not only about physical reality, it was about belief, about what could be demonstrated or accepted as true. In some cases, this led to practices aimed at confirming or displaying purity, turning a personal condition into something that could be examined or discussed. The body became a point of evidence tied to expectations that extended beyond the individual. The connection between virginity and property also played a role in shaping this system. Marriage often involved the transfer of wealth, land, or other resources. Ensuring that a union was legitimate meant ensuring that any children produced within it could inherit without dispute. This created a direct link between a woman's body and the distribution of property. Virginity became part of the mechanism that protected these arrangements, reinforcing its importance within the social structure. What emerges from this is a system that is not driven solely by moral concern. While religious teaching contributed to the importance placed on purity, it was not the only force at work. Economic interests, social stability, and the need to maintain clear lines of inheritance all contributed to the same outcome. The control of women's bodies served multiple purposes at once, making it deeply embedded within the structure of the time. This makes it difficult to separate personal experience from broader forces. A young woman's life was shaped by expectations that were not entirely her own. Her choices, her movements, and her interactions were influenced by a system that viewed her body as something that carried value beyond her as an individual. This value had to be preserved, not only for her future, but for the standing of her entire family. The emotional impact of this system is not always visible in records, but it can be inferred from the conditions it created. Living under constant observation, knowing that reputation could be affected by both action and perception, created a form of pressure that was difficult to escape. It shaped how individuals understood themselves and how they moved through their daily lives. Despite these constraints, human behavior did not always align perfectly with expectations. Relationships still formed, risks were still taken, and situations arose that challenged the system. When they did, the consequences could be severe, not only for the individuals involved, but for those connected to them. This reinforced the need for control, creating a cycle where pressure and behavior continued to influence each other. Looking at this system closely reveals how deeply it was tied to the structure of medieval life. It was not an isolated idea, but part of a network of beliefs and practices that shaped how society functioned.
Virginity became a point where personal experience, social expectation, and economic interest all intersected, making it one of the most controlled aspects of a woman's life. Virginity in the Middle Ages was not simply a personal condition, but a form of social value that determined how a woman and her family were judged and treated. As this value became more tightly controlled, it began to shape how desire itself was understood and restricted. Another layer reveals how even the idea of pleasure was reinterpreted, not as something to be shared, but as something that had to serve a specific purpose within this system. Ideas about female pleasure in the Middle Ages were not absent, but they did not function in the way modern understanding might suggest. Some medical beliefs of the time acknowledged that women experienced desire and that physical response played a role in reproduction. These ideas did not emerge from a place of equality or personal freedom. They developed within a framework that aimed to explain the body in ways that supported existing structures of marriage and inheritance. According to certain theories, conception required more than the act itself. It required a response from both individuals involved. This led to the belief that a woman's body had to reach a certain state for pregnancy to occur. At first glance, this appears to recognize female experience in a meaningful way. It suggests that women were not entirely excluded from discussions of desire, but a closer look reveals that this recognition was limited and conditional. The purpose of this belief was not to validate personal experience. It was to ensure that reproduction could be explained and managed. Female pleasure within this context was not treated as something valuable on its own. It was treated as a function. It existed only in relation to its role in producing children. This meant that even when the concept was acknowledged, it did not lead to greater freedom or autonomy. Instead, it created another layer of control. If a woman's body was believed to play an active role in conception, then her behavior and response became something to observe, interpret, and guide. The body was no longer simply a passive participant. It became an object of explanation.
This explanation did not belong to the individual. It belonged to the system that sought to understand and regulate it. Medical texts and teachings often approach the body in a detached way, describing functions and processes without reference to personal experience. This created a separation between what was felt and how it was understood. A woman's experience was filtered through interpretations that served broader purposes. It was described, categorized, and placed within a framework that prioritized order and predictability. This framework reinforced existing expectations within marriage. Intimacy remained tied to reproduction, and any recognition of pleasure was absorbed into that purpose. It did not create space for individual exploration. It did not change the structure of relationships. It simply adjusted the explanation of how those relationships functioned. The result was a system where recognition did not lead to change. Social expectations further limited how these ideas were experienced in practice. Women were still expected to fulfill roles defined by family and community. Their behavior was monitored, and their choices were shaped by the same pressures that governed other aspects of life. The acknowledgement of desire did not remove these pressures. It existed alongside them, constrained by the same boundaries. The lack of open discussion also played a role in shaping the experience. While certain ideas existed in medical or academic contexts, they were not always translated into everyday understanding. Knowledge remained uneven, and many individuals relied on fragments of information that were passed down through informal channels. This created a gap between theory and lived experience, where what was written did not always reflect what was understood. In this environment, female pleasure became something that was both present and restricted. It was recognized in theory but limited in practice. It was acknowledged in specific contexts but not openly discussed in daily life. This created a situation where the concept existed without becoming fully integrated into how people understood themselves or their relationships. The emphasis on control remained consistent. Even when the body was described in more active terms, it was still subject to external interpretation. Decisions about behavior were guided by expectations that extended beyond the individual. This meant that personal experience did not define understanding. Understanding was shaped by systems that placed the body within a larger structure. This pattern reflects a broader theme within the period. Recognition did not always lead to change. Ideas could exist within a system without altering its fundamental structure, reinterpreted, and used to support existing expectations rather than challenge them. This is what happened with the concept of female pleasure. The result was a complex and often contradictory situation. On one level, there was acknowledgement of desire. On the other hand, there was continued restriction. These two elements did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, creating a layered understanding that is difficult to interpret from a modern perspective. It is not a story of complete denial,
but it is also not a story of acceptance. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that the concept of pleasure was shaped by purpose. It was defined by what it contributed to the system, not by what it meant to the individual. This limited how it could be understood and experienced. It remained within boundaries that were set by forces outside the person who experienced it. This reveals something important about how the Middle Ages approached the body. It was not simply ignored or misunderstood. It was actively interpreted. But that interpretation was guided by specific goals. Those goals were tied to stability, reproduction, and social order. Everything else was secondary. As these layers are considered together, a clearer picture begins to form. Female pleasure was not erased, but it was not allowed to exist freely. It was shaped, directed, and contained within a system that determined its meaning. This created a reality that was neither fully restrictive nor fully open, but something in between. Female pleasure in the Middle Ages was not denied, but it was redefined in a way that kept it firmly within the boundaries of control and purpose. As this redefinition becomes clearer, it begins to connect with something that extends beyond individual experience. A deeper layer reveals how discussions of intimacy were never truly private, but tied to larger concerns about legitimacy, inheritance, and the fear of uncertainty that shaped the entire society. Discussion of the body in the Middle Ages did not always avoid directness. In certain contexts, especially within medical and legal writings, descriptions of physical response appeared with a level of clarity that can seem unexpected from a modern perspective. These texts did not always hide behind vague language. They attempted to describe processes, to explain how the body functioned, and to place those functions within a framework that could be understood and applied. This clarity, however, did not come from a desire to explore personal experience. It came from a need to explain outcomes that mattered to the structure of society. Reproduction stood at the center of this effort. The continuation of family lines, the transfer of property, and the stability of social order all depended on it. As a result, any discussion of the body was shaped by this central concern. Within this framework, physical response became something that needed to be understood in practical terms. Some theories suggested that both individuals contributed to conception and that certain conditions had to be met for it to occur successfully. This led to a recognition of bodily processes that might otherwise have been ignored. The language used to describe these processes could be direct, even detailed, because it served a specific purpose. At first glance, this directness can appear to signal a level of openness. It can seem as though the subject was approached without hesitation, as though it was accepted as a natural part of life. But this impression fades when the purpose behind the discussion is considered more carefully. The focus was not on the experience itself. It was the result that the experience was expected to produce. Legal contexts further reinforce this approach. Questions about marriage, legitimacy, and inheritance required clear definitions. In disputes over whether a marriage had been properly completed or whether a union could produce heirs, the details of physical interaction became relevant. These situations required language that could address the issue directly. The body was examined not for its own sake, but as part of a process that had legal consequences. This created a situation where clarity and restriction existed at the same time. The body could be described in precise terms, but those descriptions were always directed toward a specific outcome. There was no separation between understanding and control. Knowledge was used to reinforce the system, not to challenge it. This meant that even the most direct discussions remained within the boundaries of expectation. The effect of this approach was subtle but significant. It allowed the subject to be present in formal contexts without becoming personal. It could be discussed openly in certain settings, but only within the limits defined by purpose. Outside of those settings, the same subject returned to a state of partial silence, managed through indirect expression and controlled awareness. This duality shaped how people understood their own experiences. On one level, there was knowledge that acknowledged physical response. On the other hand, there was a structure that limited how that response could be interpreted. Individuals were aware of the processes described in texts, but their own experiences were filtered through expectations that emphasized duty and outcome over personal meaning. The presence of these discussions also reflects the broader priorities of the time. Society was organized around continuity and stability. Every aspect of life that contributed to these goals was given attention. The body as a central part of reproduction became a subject that could not be ignored, but it was not approached in isolation. It was always connected to the larger system in which it functioned. This connection limited how far the discussion could go. While certain details could be acknowledged, they could not be separated from their purpose. The idea of exploring physical experience for its own sake did not fit within this framework. It did not contribute to the goals that guided the system. Today, discussions of the body are often tied to individual experience and personal understanding. In the Middle Ages, they were tied to function. The difference is not in the presence of knowledge, but in how that knowledge was used. It was directed toward maintaining order rather than expanding awareness. This creates a sense of distance that is not immediately obvious. The language may appear familiar, the recognition of physical processes may seem similar, but the intention behind it is different. It reflects a way of thinking that places the individual within a larger structure where personal experience is secondary to collective stability. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that these discussions were not about openness. They were about precision. They aimed to define and control, to ensure that outcomes could be predicted and managed. The body was treated as part of a system, something that could be understood to serve a purpose. This approach left little room for interpretation beyond what was required. The result is a picture that feels both clear and constrained. There is knowledge, but it is limited in how it can be applied. There is recognition, but it does not lead to freedom. There is directness, but it exists within boundaries that are carefully maintained. This combination defines how the subject appears within the period. Discussion of physical response in the Middle Ages could be surprisingly direct, but it was never meant to explore personal experience, only to ensure that reproduction followed the expected path. As this focus on outcome becomes more apparent, it begins to reveal the risks that surround it. Deeper layers show how any uncertainty about reproduction could threaten not just relationships, but entire systems of inheritance and power. Adultery in the Middle Ages was not understood primarily as a matter of personal betrayal. It was viewed as a disruption to a system that depended on certainty. Relationships were closely tied to inheritance, and inheritance required clarity about lineage. In a society where property, titles, and social position were passed down through family lines, any doubt about parentage could create consequences that extended far beyond the individuals involved. This made intimacy a matter of structure rather than emotion. The question of who shared a bed with whom was not simply about personal connection. It was about the potential outcomes of that connection, particularly the possibility of children. A child born within a marriage was expected to carry the identity and rights of the father. This expectation formed the basis of how property and authority were transferred. When that expectation was challenged, the stability of the system itself came into question. Adultery introduced uncertainty into this structure. If a married woman was suspected of being involved with someone outside her marriage, the legitimacy of any child she bore could be doubted. This doubt was not a minor concern. It could lead to disputes over inheritance, conflicts within families, and challenges to established authority. The presence of uncertainty had the potential to unsettle arrangements that had been carefully constructed and maintained. Because of this, the fear surrounding adultery was not limited to moral judgment. It was tied directly to practical consequences. Families depended on clear lines of descent to secure their position. Land, wealth, and titles were all connected to this clarity. When it was disrupted, the effects could be wide-reaching. What might appear as a private matter became a point of concern for entire households and communities. The way this fear was expressed often focused on women. Their bodies became the point at which certainty could either be maintained or lost. While men could also engage in relationships outside marriage, the consequences attached to their actions were different. A man's involvement outside marriage did not create the same uncertainty about inheritance. This imbalance placed a heavier burden on women, making their behavior subject to closer observation and stricter judgment. Control became the primary response to this risk. Families and communities developed ways to monitor and limit opportunities for behavior that could lead to uncertainty. Movement was observed, interactions were managed, and situations that allowed for unsupervised contact were often avoided. These measures were not always presented as restrictions. They were framed as necessary steps to protect stability and prevent potential conflict. At the same time, reputation played a critical role in maintaining the system. Even without clear evidence, suspicion alone could be damaging. In closely connected communities where information spread quickly and was not easily forgotten, an accusation could carry long-lasting consequences. This meant that maintaining appearance was as important as maintaining reality. Individuals were expected to avoid not only improper behavior, but also situations that might lead to suspicion. Legal systems reflected this concern as well. Cases involving adultery could involve questions about legitimacy, inheritance, and responsibility. The focus was not only on the act itself, but on its potential outcomes. Determining whether a child belonged to a particular lineage was a matter that could require investigation and judgment. These cases reveal how deeply the issue was connected to the structure of society. The emotional aspect of adultery, while not absent, was often secondary to these concerns. Personal betrayal was recognized, but it did not carry the same weight as the consequences for inheritance and social order. This does not mean that individuals did not feel anger or disappointment. It means that the system in which they lived placed greater emphasis on stability than on personal experience. This difference becomes clearer when compared to modern perspectives. Today, discussions of adultery often center on trust, emotion, and personal relationships. In the Middle Ages, these elements existed, but they were not the primary focus. The primary concern was the effect on lineage and the potential disruption of established structures. This shifted the way the issue was understood and addressed. The constant awareness of this risk shaped behavior in subtle ways. It influenced how people interacted, how relationships were formed, and how boundaries were maintained. It created an environment where personal actions were connected to broader consequences, reinforcing the importance of control and caution. This awareness was not always visible, but it was present in the decisions people made. Despite these measures, uncertainty could not be eliminated. Human behavior does not always follow the structures designed to contain it. Relationships still formed outside expected boundaries, and situations arose that challenged the system. When they did, the consequences could be significant, not only for the individuals involved, but for those connected to them. This reveals a deeper tension within the society. On one side, there was a strong desire for order and certainty. On the other hand, there was the reality of human behavior which could not be fully controlled. The interaction between these two forces shaped how adultery was understood and why it was feared. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that adultery represented more than a personal act. It represented a point where individual behavior could intersect with the structure of society in a way that created instability. This is what gave it its significance. It was not simply about breaking a rule. It was about introducing doubt into a system that depended on clarity. Adultery in the Middle Ages was feared not just as a betrayal between individuals, but as a threat to the social order and the family, but as a threat to the certainty that held families, property, and power together. As this fear of uncertainty deepened, it began to shape how society responded to behavior that could not be easily controlled. This next layer reveals how that response did not eliminate risk, but instead pushed it into spaces where it became more hidden, more accepted, and quietly integrated into everyday life. Prostitution in the Middle Ages was not always hidden in the way modern imagination often assumes. In many towns and growing cities, it existed in forms that were known, recognized, and in some cases quietly tolerated. It did not occupy a completely invisible space. Instead, it operated within boundaries that were understood, even if they were not openly approved. This created a situation where something officially condemned could remain part of daily life. Urban environments played a key role in shaping this reality. As towns expanded and populations increased, social structures became more complex. Movement between different groups of people became more frequent, and anonymity, though limited, was more possible than in smaller rural communities. Within this setting, certain activities that might have been more tightly controlled elsewhere found space to exist. Prostitution became one of those activities. Authorities were aware of its presence. In many cases, they did not attempt to remove it entirely. Instead, they developed ways to contain it. Specific areas were designated, certain rules were applied, and efforts were made to keep the activity within defined limits. This approach did not reflect acceptance. It reflected calculation. Removing the activity completely was seen as difficult and perhaps even unrealistic, but containing it was considered a more manageable solution. This created a system where contradiction became part of normal life. Publicly, prostitution was described as immoral and undesirable. Religious teachings reinforced this view, presenting it as something that should be avoided. At the same time, practical decisions allowed it to continue under certain conditions. This difference between what was said and what was done reveals a pattern that appears in many aspects of medieval society. The reasoning behind this approach was often framed in terms of control. By allowing prostitution to exist in specific areas, authorities believed they could limit its influence elsewhere. It was seen as a way to prevent behavior from spreading into spaces that were considered more respectable. This logic did not remove the activity. It redirected it, placing it where it could be observed and managed more easily. The individuals involved in the system lived within its contradictions. Women who worked in these environments were often subject to regulation, required to follow rules that marked their position within society. Their presence was tolerated, but they were not treated as equal participants in the community. They occupied a space that was both visible and separate, recognized but not fully accepted. Clients, on the other hand, moved between these spaces and the rest of society with fewer visible consequences. This difference reflects a broader pattern of imbalance, where certain behaviors were judged differently depending on who was involved. The system did not apply its standards evenly. It adjusted them in ways that preserved existing structures. The physical presence of these establishments also contributed to their normalization. They were not always hidden behind layers of secrecy. In some places, their locations were known, their existence acknowledged as part of the urban landscape. This did not mean that they were openly discussed in polite settings. It meant that they were understood as something that existed alongside other aspects of daily life. What makes this particularly striking is the way in which it reflects human behavior more broadly. Systems that aim to control or restrict certain actions often develop methods of accommodation. They create spaces where those actions can continue in a limited form. This does not resolve the tension between rule and reality. It manages it. Prostitution in the Middle Ages is one example of this process. The presence of such spaces also influenced how people thought about behavior and responsibility. By placing certain activities within defined areas, it became possible to separate them from other parts of life, at least in appearance. This separation allowed individuals to engage with the system while maintaining a sense of distance from it. It reinforced the idea that behavior could be contained without being eliminated. At the same time, this arrangement did not remove the underlying risks or consequences. Health concerns, social judgment, and the instability associated with such environments remained present. The system did not solve these issues. It simply created a structure in which they could exist in a controlled form. This reflects a broader approach to governance during the period, where management often replaced resolution. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that prostitution was not an isolated phenomenon. It was connected to economic conditions, social structures, and patterns of urban life. It provided income for some, responded to demand from others, and existed within a framework that attempted to balance moral teaching with practical reality. This combination made it a persistent part of the environment. The contradiction between condemnation and tolerance is what defines this aspect of medieval life. It shows how systems can hold opposing positions at the same time, maintaining a public stance while allowing a different reality to continue beneath it. This dual approach did not remove tension. It preserved it, allowing society to function without fully resolving the conflict. As this pattern becomes clearer, it also reveals something about how control operated more generally. It was not absolute. It adapted to circumstances, sometimes allowing what it could not fully prevent. This created a landscape where certain activities were both restricted and present, existing within boundaries that were constantly negotiated. Prostitution in the Middle Ages was not hidden away as completely as many assume, but existed within a system that both condemned and quietly allowed it to continue. As this contradiction becomes more visible, it begins to reveal the conditions in which such encounters actually took place. The next layer shows how intimacy itself often occurred in environments that were far from private, far from clean, and far from anything that resembles modern comfort. Intimacy in the Middle Ages did not take place in environments that were clean, private, or comfortable by modern standards. It unfolded within the same conditions that shaped the rest of daily life, conditions that were often crowded, limited, and difficult to separate from the presence of others. The idea of a quiet, isolated space designed for personal moments was not part of most people's reality. Instead, intimacy existed within environments that were shared, visible, and shaped by necessity. Many households consisted of a single main room or a small number of connected spaces. Families lived together closely, sometimes across multiple generations, with little separation between areas for sleeping, eating, and working. Servants or workers might also be present depending on the household. This meant that private moments were rarely completely private. Even when individuals attempted to create separation, the awareness of others nearby remained constant. This lack of privacy influenced how intimacy was approached. It required careful timing and an understanding of the rhythms of the household. It also meant that the experience was shaped by external awareness. Even if no one was directly observing, the presence of others created a background that could not be fully ignored, turning something personal into something that existed within a shared environment. Physical conditions added another layer to this experience. Hygiene standards were very different from what is familiar today. Regular bathing was not always possible, and access to clean water could be limited. Clothing worn for long periods absorbed the effects of daily labor, carrying traces of sweat, dirt, and the environment. Bodies reflected the conditions in which people lived, and these conditions were not easily separated from moments of intimacy. Health also played a role in shaping these experiences. Without modern medical understanding, people lived with a range of illnesses and discomforts that were part of everyday life. Infections, untreated conditions, and physical strain were common. These factors did not disappear in private moments. They remained present, influencing how those moments were experienced. Intimacy was not removed from the realities of the body. It existed within them. The environment itself contributed to this sense of weight. Air within enclosed spaces could be heavy, influenced by cooking fires, limited ventilation, and the presence of multiple people. Light was often dim, provided by candles or small openings that allowed limited daylight. Surfaces were not always clean, and materials were used repeatedly without the kind of maintenance expected today. All of these elements combined to create a setting that felt very different from modern expectations of comfort. What stands out is how closely intimacy was tied to the realities of daily life. It did not exist as a separate experience removed from work, family, or environment. It was part of the same structure, shaped by the same limitations. This made it more direct, less controlled by idealized expectations, and more influenced by necessity. The emotional experience was also affected by these conditions. Without privacy and comfort, it was more difficult to separate the moment from its surroundings. Awareness of others, physical discomfort, and environmental factors all contributed to how the experience was understood. This did not mean that connection or feeling was absent. It meant that those elements existed within a setting that did not prioritize them. Modern imagination often separates intimacy from these realities, placing it in spaces designed for comfort and privacy. In contrast, medieval life did not offer that separation. The same room that held daily activity also held personal moments. The same conditions that shaped work and survival also shaped intimacy. This continuity created an experience that felt heavier and more grounded in physical reality. The absence of controlled environments also meant that unpredictability was part of the experience. Noise, movement, and the presence of others could not always be avoided. These factors introduced interruptions and limitations that shaped how moments unfolded. Intimacy had to adapt to these conditions, becoming something that fit within the structure of daily life rather than existing outside of it. Clothing and materials further influenced this experience. Layers of fabric, often worn for extended periods, were not easily removed or replaced. Bedding, where it existed, was shared and reused, shaped by the same limitations that affected other aspects of life. These elements contributed to a sense of continuity between daily existence and private moments, reinforcing the idea that there was no clear boundary between them. This combination of factors created a form of intimacy that was less about escape and more about coexistence with reality. It was not idealized or separated from the physical world. It was part of it. This made it more direct, sometimes more difficult, and often less aligned with modern ideas of comfort or romance. Understanding this helps to reshape how the Middle Ages are viewed. It moves away from the idea of a distant, simplified past and toward a more detailed understanding of how people actually lived. It shows how personal experiences were influenced by conditions that were shared across many aspects of life, creating a consistency that is not always recognized. The difference is not only in the presence of discomfort, but in how that discomfort was integrated into daily experience. It was not treated as something unusual. It was expected, part of the environment in which people lived. This expectation shaped how individuals approached all aspects of life, including intimacy. Intimacy in the Middle Ages did not take place in clean, private, or carefully controlled environments, but in the same crowded and imperfect spaces where daily life unfolded. As these conditions become clearer, they begin to connect with the expectations that shaped behavior within them. What follows reveals how intimacy itself was often treated less as a personal experience, and more as a duty that had to be fulfilled within these difficult conditions. Intimacy in the Middle Ages was not separated from the structure of daily life. It was not placed into a category of experience defined by emotion or personal exploration. Instead, it was closely tied to the same forces that shaped work, survival, and responsibility. Within this framework, it functioned less as a private moment and more as something that had to be carried out as part of a broader system. The connection between intimacy and reproduction was central to this understanding. Marriage was expected to produce children, and children were necessary for maintaining family lines, securing inheritance, and preserving social position. This expectation did not exist as a distant goal. It was present in everyday life, influencing how relationships were formed and how they were sustained. Intimacy became one of the mechanisms through which this expectation was fulfilled. Because of this, the act itself was not always approached as something driven by personal feeling. It was approached as something that needed to happen. The idea of timing, frequency, and purpose was often shaped by external expectations rather than individual desire. This created a pattern where the act was repeated as part of a routine, similar to other responsibilities that structured daily life. Responsibility played a defining role in shaping this experience. A husband was expected to fulfill his role within the marriage, not only in providing for the household, but also in ensuring that the family line continued. A wife was expected to contribute to this outcome through her own role within the relationship. These expectations were not optional. They were part of the agreement that defined marriage, and they influenced how intimacy was understood. This does not mean that desire was absent. It means that desire was not the primary force guiding behavior. Even when it was present, it existed alongside responsibility, often shaped by it. The presence of expectation could alter how desire was experienced, placing it within a context that emphasized outcome over feeling. This created a dynamic where personal experience was closely connected to obligation. Fear also played a role in shaping this dynamic. The consequences of failing to meet expectations could be significant. The inability to produce children could lead to tension within the marriage, concern within the family, and uncertainty about the future. These pressures influenced how individuals approached their roles, reinforcing the idea that intimacy was not simply a personal matter, but a necessary part of maintaining stability. The influence of religion further reinforced this structure. Teachings about appropriate behavior, timing, and intention shaped how intimacy was viewed. There were periods when it was discouraged and expectations about how it should occur. These teachings did not remove the obligation. They shaped it, placing it within a moral framework that defined what was acceptable and what was not. This added another layer of complexity, where behavior had to align with both social and religious expectations. Daily life provided little separation between these influences. Work, family, and environment were closely connected, and intimacy existed within that same network. There was no clear boundary that separated it from other responsibilities. It was part of the same routine, influenced by the same conditions, and shaped by the same limitations. This continuity made it feel less like an isolated experience and more like an integrated part of life. The comparison to modern perspectives highlights this difference clearly. Today, intimacy is often framed in terms of connection, communication, and shared experience. It is associated with personal choice and emotional expression. In contrast, the medieval approach placed it within a system of duty and expectation. It was something that contributed to a larger purpose, not something that existed independently. This difference can be difficult to fully grasp because it challenges familiar assumptions. It requires shifting the focus away from individual experience and toward the structure in which that experience occurred. It reveals a form of intimacy that is shaped by necessity rather than guided by personal preference. It shows how behavior can be influenced by forces that extend beyond the individual. The physical and emotional aspects of the experience were not removed from this structure. They existed within it. This meant that even moments that might have contained elements of connection were still influenced by the broader system. They were not separate from it. They were part of it, shaped by the same expectations and limitations. Over time, this created a pattern that defined how intimacy was understood. It was seen as something that had to be fulfilled, something that contributed to stability, and something that was closely connected to other responsibilities. It was not placed at the center of personal identity. It was integrated into the structure of life in a way that made it both necessary and constrained. Looking at this pattern more closely reveals how deeply it was embedded within the society. It was not an isolated feature. It was part of a network of expectations that shaped behavior across many areas of life. Understanding this helps to explain why intimacy was approached in this way and why it differed so significantly from modern perspectives. The result is a form of experience that feels grounded in reality rather than shaped by idealization. It reflects a world where personal moments were influenced by broader forces, where individual feeling existed alongside responsibility, and where behavior was guided by the need to maintain order. Intimacy in the Middle Ages functioned less as a romantic experience and more as a responsibility tied to survival, stability, and expectation. As this sense of duty becomes clearer, it begins to reveal how people responded to it in ways that were not always visible. What follows shows how even within strict systems of obligation, individuals continued to act in ways that created a hidden world of behavior beneath the surface. Confession in the Middle Ages was meant to bring order to the inner life. It was designed as a system through which individuals could examine their thoughts, admit their actions, and return to a path defined as correct. From the outside, it appears as a powerful tool of control, one that reached into the most private parts of a person's experience. It required individuals to speak about what they had done, to reflect on what they had thought, and to place those experiences within a moral structure. What it also did, perhaps unintentionally, was record traces of behavior that would otherwise remain hidden. Confession created a space where individuals described actions and thoughts that did not match the image of obedience often associated with the period. These records, whether written directly or reflected in guidance manuals, reveal a reality that is far more complex than the surface suggests. The range of what appears in these accounts is striking. Individuals spoke about temptations, about repeated behaviors, and about situations that challenged the expectations placed upon them. These were not isolated incidents. They appeared frequently enough to suggest patterns, to indicate that what was being described was not unusual. It shows that beneath the structure of rules, there was a constant presence of human behavior that did not fully align with those rules. This does not mean that individuals rejected the system entirely. Many approached confession with seriousness, believing in its purpose and seeking to correct their actions. But the very need for repeated confession suggests that behavior did not simply change after being acknowledged. It continued, shaped by the same forces that influenced it before. This created a cycle where action, reflection, and repetition were closely linked. What becomes visible through this cycle is the persistence of desire. It did not disappear under the influence of teaching or expectation. It remained active, appearing in different forms and under different circumstances. Confession did not remove it. It brought it into language, allowing it to be described and examined even as it remained difficult to control. The act of speaking about these experiences also reveals how individuals understood themselves. They were aware of the boundaries they were expected to follow. They recognized when they had crossed them. This awareness created a form of internal tension where personal experience existed alongside the knowledge that it was considered wrong. Confession became a way of managing that tension rather than eliminating it. Guidance given to confessors further highlights this complexity. Manuals instructed how to question individuals, what details to ask for, and how to interpret responses. These instructions suggest that the range of possible experiences was well understood. The system did not operate under the assumption that people were always obedient. It operated with the expectation that they were not, and that they would need to return repeatedly to the process of confession. This reveals a different image of medieval society than the one often imagined. It was not a world where rules were followed without deviation. It was a world where rules existed alongside behavior that did not always match them. The presence of confession made this visible even as it attempted to guide individuals back toward compliance. The gap between appearance and reality becomes clearer in this context. Publicly, individuals were expected to maintain a certain image. They were part of communities where reputation mattered, where behavior was observed and judged. Privately, their experiences could be very different. Confession bridged these two spaces, bringing private behavior into a controlled form of public acknowledgement. This process did not eliminate secrecy. It structured it. Individuals revealed certain aspects of their behavior within a specific setting under specific conditions. Outside of that setting, much remained unspoken. This created layers of visibility where some aspects of life were acknowledged and others remained hidden. The system did not remove complexity. It managed it. What is particularly striking is how familiar this pattern can feel when examined closely. The difference lies not in the presence of desire or behavior, but in how it was handled. Medieval individuals lived within a framework that required them to recognize and respond to their actions in a formal way. This created a rhythm of behavior and reflection that shaped how they understood themselves. The persistence of confession also indicates that behavior was not easily changed through instruction alone. Rules could define what was expected, but they could not fully reshape human experience. Individuals continued to act in ways that reflected their own circumstances, even as they acknowledged the expectations placed upon them. This tension between rule and behavior is central to understanding the period. Looking more closely at these records challenges the idea of a society defined by strict obedience. It reveals a world where individuals navigated their own realities within a system that sought to guide them. It shows that behavior was varied, that experiences were complex, and that the image of uniform compliance does not fully capture what was happening. The presence of confession as a central practice highlights this contradiction. It was both a tool of control and a record of its limits. It showed where behavior aligned with expectation and where it did not. It created a structured way of addressing actions, but it also revealed how persistent those actions could be. This makes it clear that medieval individuals were not fundamentally different from people today in terms of desire or behavior. What differed was the system in which they lived and how that system required them to respond. They did not lack impulse. They lived within a structure that required those impulses to be acknowledged, managed, and often concealed. Confession in the Middle Ages reveals not a world of perfect obedience, but a world where human behavior continued beneath the surface, recorded in fragments of admission and repetition. As these fragments come together, they begin to show a reality that extends beyond individual experience. The next layer reveals how rules did not stop behavior, but instead shaped when it could happen, where it could occur, and under what conditions it was considered acceptable. Rules in the Middle Ages did not stop at defining what was acceptable. They extended into when and how behavior should take place. Intimacy within marriage, already shaped by obligation and expectation, was further structured by religious timing. It was not enough for an act to occur within the boundaries of marriage. It also had to occur at the right moment, under the right conditions, and in alignment with a calendar that reflected religious authority. This introduced a layer of regulation that reached into the most private aspects of life. Specific periods were marked as inappropriate for marital relations. Certain holy days, seasons of fasting, and times of religious observance were treated as moments when intimacy should be avoided. These restrictions were not occasional suggestions. They were part of a broader framework that defined how life should be ordered. The presence of this framework meant that personal decisions were not entirely personal. A couple could not simply act based on their own circumstances or desires. Their actions were expected to align with a schedule that extended beyond their household. This schedule was shared by the wider community, reinforcing the idea that behavior was part of a collective pattern rather than an individual choice. This connection between private life and public structure created a unique form of awareness. Individuals were not only aware of their own situation but also of the expectations that surrounded them. The calendar served as a constant reminder of when certain actions were considered appropriate and when they were not. It brought external authority into moments that might otherwise have remained separate. The reasoning behind these restrictions was tied to ideas about discipline and order. Religious observance required periods of restraint, times when the focus was meant to shift away from physical concerns and towards spiritual ones. Intimacy, even within marriage, could be seen as a distraction during these periods. By limiting when it could occur, the system aimed to maintain a balance between physical life and spiritual expectation. In practice, this added complexity to an already structured experience. Couples had to navigate not only their own relationship, but also the timing imposed upon it. This required attention to external factors, adjusting behavior to fit within a framework that was not entirely under their control. It reinforced the idea that intimacy was part of a system, not separate from it. The effect of this system can be seen in how individuals understood their own actions. Intimacy was not simply evaluated based on whether it occurred within marriage. It was also judged based on timing and context. An act that might be acceptable at one moment could be considered inappropriate at another. This introduced a level of variability that depended on factors beyond the immediate relationship. This variability also influenced how people approached their behavior. It required awareness and consideration, encouraging individuals to think about their actions in relation to the broader structure. This did not eliminate behavior that fell outside these boundaries, but it did shape how that behavior was understood and responded to. It added another layer to the negotiation between rule and reality. The presence of these restrictions highlights how deeply religious influence extended into daily life. It was not limited to public ceremonies or visible practices. It reached into private spaces, shaping actions that were not directly observed. This influence was maintained through shared understanding, reinforced by teaching and community expectation. At the same time, the system relied on individual compliance. It could define rules, but it could not enforce them at every moment. This created a situation where individuals were responsible for aligning their behavior with expectations. It required internal awareness, a recognition of what was appropriate and when. This internalization of rules became a key part of how control was maintained. Despite this, behavior did not always align perfectly with expectations. Individuals continued to act in ways that reflected their own circumstances, sometimes following the rules and sometimes moving outside them. This did not remove the influence of the system. It showed its limits. It revealed that even detailed regulation could not fully account for human behavior. The interaction between timing and behavior also reflects a broader theme within the period. Life was structured by systems that aimed to create order, But those systems existed alongside individual experiences that did not always fit neatly within them. This created a dynamic where rules and reality were constantly interacting, shaping each other in subtle ways. Understanding this dynamic helps to clarify how intimacy was experienced. It was not simply about two individuals and their relationship. It was about how that relationship fit within a larger pattern of expectation. Timing, context, and external influence all played a role in shaping how and when intimacy occurred. This perspective challenges the idea that private life existed separately from public structure. In the Middle Ages, the two were closely connected. Actions that might seem entirely personal were influenced by shared systems of belief and practice. This connection shaped how individuals understood themselves and their relationships. The result is a form of experience that feels both structured and uncertain. Structured because it is guided by clear expectations. Uncertain because those expectations cannot fully contain human behavior. This tension defines much of what is seen when looking closely at the period. Intimacy in the Middle Ages was not only shaped by who was involved, but by when and under what conditions it was allowed to occur. As these layers of control become more visible, they begin to reveal the risks that remained despite them. Another perspective reveals how the presence of illness and physical vulnerability turned even the closest moments into something that carried fear as much as expectation. Illness in the Middle Ages was not something separate from daily life. It existed alongside work, family, and every routine that shaped how people lived. Without modern medical knowledge, many conditions were poorly understood and their causes remained unclear. Pain, infection, and physical discomfort were common experiences, often accepted as part of life rather than something that could be easily explained or treated. This constant presence of illness influenced not only survival, but also the way intimacy was experienced. The body was not viewed through the lens of precise diagnosis. Instead, it was understood through a mixture of observation, belief, and inherited knowledge. Symptoms appeared without a clear explanation, and treatments were often based on tradition rather than evidence. This created an environment where uncertainty was always present. People could feel the effects of illness, but they could not always understand where it came from or how it might progress. Within this context, intimacy carried a different kind of weight. It was not only an act shaped by expectation and duty, but also one influenced by physical risk. Close contact between individuals meant exposure to conditions that were not always visible. Without a clear understanding of how disease spread, the connection between intimacy and illness was often sensed rather than explained. This made the experience more uncertain, shaped by both necessity and unease. Infections and physical conditions could affect individuals in ways that were difficult to manage. Discomfort, pain, and visible symptoms could alter how the body responded, making intimacy more complicated. These effects were not always discussed openly, but they were part of lived experience. They influenced how individuals approached their relationships, even if the underlying causes remained unclear. Fear also played a role in shaping this experience. Concerns about reproduction were closely tied to concerns about health. Pregnancy itself carried risks, and complications could arise without warning. The possibility of illness added another layer to these concerns. Intimacy was not only connected to the hope of continuing the family line, but also to the potential for harm. This created a tension between expectation and risk. The lack of reliable treatment meant that once illness appeared, it could persist. Conditions could worsen over time, and their effects could spread within households in shared living environments where multiple individuals occupied the same space. The boundaries between one person's condition and another's experience were not always clear. This reinforced the sense that health was not entirely under individual control. The connection between intimacy and illness did not remove the expectation that intimacy should occur. Instead, it existed alongside it. Individuals were expected to fulfill their roles within marriage, even when physical conditions made those roles more difficult. This created a situation where duty continued despite uncertainty, where behavior was shaped by expectation even in the presence of risk. The environment contributed to this complexity. Limited access to clean water, the reuse of clothing and materials, and the conditions of daily labor all affected the body. These factors did not disappear in private moments. They remained present, influencing how intimacy was experienced. The physical reality of life was closely connected to every aspect of personal interaction. What makes this particularly striking is how it contrasts with modern expectations. Today, there is a greater understanding of how illness spreads and how it can be managed. In the Middle Ages, this understanding was incomplete. The body was experienced directly, but its processes were not fully explained.
This created a gap between experience and knowledge, where individuals had to navigate uncertainty without clear guidance. Despite this, life continued.
Relationships formed, families grew, and daily routines carried on. The presence of illness did not stop these processes. It shaped them. It influenced how individuals approached their roles, how they understood their experiences, and how they responded to the risks they faced. Intimacy was not removed from this environment.
It was part of it.
The emotional impact of this situation is not always recorded directly, but it can be understood through the conditions it created. Living with uncertainty, experiencing discomfort, and facing risks without a clear explanation would have shaped how individuals felt about their own bodies and their relationships. It added a layer of awareness that was always present, even if it was not always expressed. This awareness did not eliminate the need for intimacy. It existed alongside it, creating a balance that was not always stable. Individuals moved between expectation and caution, between duty and uncertainty.
This movement reflects a broader pattern within medieval life, where many aspects of experience were shaped by conditions that could not be fully controlled. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that intimacy was not only influenced by social structure and expectation, but also by the physical realities of the body. These realities were unpredictable, often uncomfortable, and sometimes dangerous. They formed a background that could not be ignored, shaping how personal experiences were understood. This perspective changes how the Middle Ages can be viewed. It reveals a world where personal moments were closely tied to broader conditions, where the body itself was a source of both connection and concern. It shows how intimacy existed within an environment that was far from stable, influenced by factors that extended beyond individual choice. Intimacy in the Middle Ages was not only shaped by expectation and duty, but also by the constant presence of illness and physical uncertainty. As this sense of risk becomes clearer, it begins to reveal how people responded to it in ways that were not always visible. A hidden layer reveals how a society built on control and fear gradually created a world filled with quiet secrets, contradictions, and lives that unfolded beneath the surface. Silence in the Middle Ages did not mean absence. It often meant concealment.
A society shaped by rules, expectations, and constant reminders of right and wrong created an environment where certain aspects of life were pushed out of open view. What could not be openly expressed did not disappear. It moved into spaces that were less visible, forming patterns of behavior that existed alongside the official structure of society. This dynamic can be seen in how individuals managed their private lives. Publicly, they were expected to present themselves in ways that aligned with social and religious expectations. Reputation mattered, and maintaining that reputation required careful attention to how one appeared to others. Behavior was observed, discussed, and remembered within communities where boundaries between individuals were often thin. This encouraged outward conformity, shaping how people acted in visible spaces. Privately, however, life followed a different rhythm. Individuals made decisions based on their own circumstances, needs, and experiences. These decisions did not always match the expectations placed upon them. The difference between what was shown and what was lived created a layer of secrecy that became part of everyday existence. It was not necessarily dramatic or exceptional. It was consistent and often quiet. This pattern extended across different parts of society. Within marriage, individuals navigated expectations that did not always align with their own feelings. Outside of marriage, relationships could form that existed beyond accepted boundaries. In religious settings where discipline and restraint were emphasized, behavior could still emerge that reflected the same human tendencies found elsewhere. The presence of rules did not remove these tendencies. It shaped how they were expressed. The result was a form of dual existence. Individuals lived with one set of behaviors that were visible and another that remained hidden. These two aspects were not entirely separate. They influenced each other, creating a balance that had to be maintained. The visible side preserved reputation and stability. The hidden side allowed for experiences that could not be openly acknowledged. This duality was reinforced by the structure of the society itself. Systems of control relied on visibility. They functioned by observing behavior, defining what was acceptable, and responding when those expectations were not met. At the same time, these systems could not reach into every moment of private life. This created spaces where behavior could occur without direct oversight. Those spaces became part of how individuals navigated their environment. Secrecy in this context was not only about hiding actions. It was about managing how those actions were integrated into life. Individuals learned how to move between different expectations, adjusting their behavior depending on the situation. This required awareness, an understanding of when to conform and when to act differently. It became a skill shaped by the conditions of the time. The presence of secrecy also influenced how information moved within communities. Rumors, hints, and indirect knowledge became part of how people understood each other. Not everything was spoken openly, but much was known or suspected. This created a shared awareness that existed beneath the surface where individuals understood more than they could publicly acknowledge. What makes this particularly striking is how it challenges the idea of a simple, controlled society. The presence of strict rules might suggest uniform behavior, but the reality was more complex. The rules existed, but they were not always followed in the way they were intended. Instead, they interacted with human behavior in ways that produced layered outcomes. This layering can be seen in the contrast between official records and personal experience. Written documents often present a clear and structured view of how life should be lived. Personal accounts, where they exist, reveal a different perspective, one shaped by individual circumstances and choices. The difference between these sources highlights the gap between expectation and reality. The emotional dimension of this dual existence is not always directly recorded, but it can be inferred. Living between two sets of expectations, one public and one private, would have required constant adjustment. It would have shaped how individuals understood themselves, how they related to others, and how they navigated their daily lives.
This adjustment was not temporary.
It was ongoing. Over time, this pattern became part of the fabric of society.
It was not an exception. It was a condition that influenced many aspects of life.
It affected relationships, communication, and behavior, creating a world where what was visible did not fully represent what was real. Understanding this helps to explain why the Middle Ages can feel both distant and familiar. The structures are different, the expectations are different, but the presence of hidden layers remains recognizable. It reveals how systems of control and human behavior interact in ways that produce outcomes that are not always straightforward. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that the idea of a purely controlled society does not hold. What appears as order on the surface often contains complexity beneath it. This complexity is what defines the period, shaping how individuals lived within the structures that surrounded them. A society that tried to enforce silence did not create purity, but created a world where much of life existed beneath the surface, hidden but persistent. As this hidden world becomes clearer, it begins to connect with places where control was expected to be strongest. Deeper layers reveal how even spaces devoted to discipline and separation could not escape the same patterns of human behavior. Monastic life in the Middle Ages was meant to represent separation from the world. It was built on discipline, routine, and the rejection of ordinary desires. Those who entered these spaces committed themselves to a life that followed strict rules, guided by prayer, work, and obedience. From the outside, it appears as a place where human impulses were set aside, where individuals removed themselves from the conditions that shaped everyday life. This image suggests a clear boundary between the religious world and the rest of society. It creates the impression that by entering a monastery or convent, a person could step away from the complexities that defined ordinary experience. The structure of monastic life reinforced this idea, with schedules that regulated time, behavior, and interaction. Every part of daily life was organized to support discipline and control, but removing someone from the outside world did not remove what they carried within them. Human experience does not disappear when the environment changes. It adapts. The same impulses that existed outside the walls remained present inside them, shaped by new conditions, but not eliminated. This created a tension between expectation and reality that can be seen in the records that have survived. Accounts of monastic life reveal moments where behavior did not align with the ideals that define these spaces. Rumors circulated within communities, suggesting that the boundaries between discipline and desire were not always maintained. These rumors were not isolated. They appeared often enough to become part of how these institutions were understood, even if they were not openly acknowledged. More formal records provide additional insight. Cases were documented where individuals within religious communities were accused of actions that went against their vows. These cases were investigated, judged, and sometimes punished, leaving behind traces that reveal the presence of behavior that was not meant to exist within these settings. The details vary, but the pattern remains consistent.
The rules were clear, but adherence to them was not absolute. This does not mean that monastic life failed in its purpose. Many individuals followed the discipline expected of them, maintaining routines that reflected commitment and belief. But the presence of exceptions shows that the system could not fully control human behavior. It could define expectations, but it could not remove the conditions that made those expectations difficult to maintain. The environment itself contributed to this complexity. Monastic communities were not empty spaces. They were populated by individuals living closely together, sharing routines, responsibilities, and time. This proximity created relationships, interactions, and moments of connection that could not be entirely separated from human experience. Even within a structured setting, these elements remained present. The concept of separation also had limits. While monasteries and convents were designed to distance individuals from the outside world, they were not completely isolated from it. Communication, movement, and interaction with surrounding communities still occurred. This connection meant that the influences of the wider world continued to shape life within these spaces, even if indirectly. What emerges from this is not a contradiction but a continuation of a pattern seen throughout medieval society. Systems of control existed and they were taken seriously. At the same time, human behavior continued to exist within and around those systems. The presence of rules did not eliminate behavior. It shaped how that behavior appeared and how it was managed. This pattern becomes clearer when looking at how these situations were addressed. When behavior did not align with expectation, it was often treated as a deviation that needed correction. Investigations, punishments, and reforms were used to restore order. This response reinforces the idea that the system was designed to manage behavior rather than to assume its complete absence. The emotional dimension of this experience is not always directly recorded, but it can be understood through the conditions that existed. Living within strict expectations while still experiencing impulses that did not align with them would have created a form of internal tension. This tension was not unique to monastic life. It reflected a broader experience shared across different parts of society. The presence of such tension highlights a key aspect of human behavior. It shows that impulses are not easily removed through structure alone. They persist, adapting to different environments and appearing in ways that reflect the conditions in which they exist. This persistence does not negate the role of discipline. It reveals its limits. Understanding this helps to reshape how monastic life is viewed. It is not simply a story of complete separation or perfect discipline. It is a story of individuals living within a system that aimed to guide them while still carrying the same elements of human experience found elsewhere. It reflects the interaction between structure and behavior, showing how one influences the other. This interaction is not confined to religious settings. It appears in different forms across medieval life wherever systems of control meet individual experience. Monastic communities provide a clear example because of the strength of the expectations placed upon them. The contrast between those expectations and the reality that emerges makes the pattern more visible. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that the idea of complete control is difficult to sustain. Systems can shape behavior, guide it, and respond to it, but they cannot fully remove it. This is true not only within monasteries but across the entire society. It reflects a balance between order and experience that defines much of what is seen. The Middle Ages, when examined through this perspective, appear less as a world of strict separation and more as a world of continuous negotiation. Rules and expectations existed, but they interacted with human behavior in ways that produced outcomes that were not always predictable. This creates a picture that is both structured and complex. Monastic life in the Middle Ages was built on discipline and separation. Yet it could not fully remove the human impulses it sought to control. As this limitation becomes clearer, it begins to connect with patterns seen beyond religious spaces. Deeper layers reveal how behaviors that did not fit within accepted norms continued to exist, not openly, but within forms that were pushed into the margins of society. Relationships that did not fit within accepted norms in the Middle Ages did not disappear. They existed in forms that were less visible, shaped by the conditions that made open expression difficult or dangerous. Social and religious expectations defined what was considered acceptable, and anything that moved outside those boundaries was treated with suspicion. This did not remove the presence of such relationships. It changed how they appeared and how they were understood. Norms were reinforced through teaching, law, and community expectations. These forces worked together to define behavior and to create a clear distinction between what was allowed and what was not. Relationships that did not align with these expectations were often described in negative terms, associated with moral failure or disorder. This language shaped how they were perceived, placing them outside the structure that guided most aspects of life. Because of this, individuals who experienced or acted on these desires could not live openly in the same way as others. Expression had to be managed carefully, often limited to private spaces where observation was less likely. Even in those spaces, the possibility of exposure remained. The risk of being discovered influenced behavior, creating a constant awareness of potential consequences. Information about such relationships often appears in indirect forms. Rumors circulated within communities, hinting at behavior that was not openly acknowledged. Accusations could arise, sometimes based on evidence and sometimes on suspicion alone. These accusations could lead to investigation, judgment, and punishment, leaving records that provide glimpses into experiences that were otherwise hidden. Legal and religious responses to these situations reflect the seriousness with which they were treated. Cases involving relationships outside accepted norms were often framed in terms of violation, not only of moral expectations, but of social order. The focus was not only on individual behavior, but on its perceived impact on the stability of the community. This reinforced the idea that such relationships were not simply personal matters. Punishment, when it occurred, served both as a response and a warning. It aimed to correct behavior and to discourage others from similar actions. This created an environment where fear played a significant role in shaping how individuals navigated their own experiences. The possibility of consequence was always present, influencing decisions and limiting expression. Silence became another way in which these relationships existed. Not everything was spoken openly, even when it was known. Communities often maintained a level of awareness without direct acknowledgement, allowing certain realities to remain unaddressed as long as they did not disrupt visible order. This silence was not the same as absence. It was a form of management, a way of allowing something to exist without bringing it into the open. The presence of these patterns reveals a broader aspect of medieval life. Systems that define strict boundaries often create conditions where behavior moves into less visible forms. The more strongly something is restricted, the more carefully it must be managed. This does not eliminate it. It changes how it is expressed and how it is understood. What makes this particularly important is how it challenges the idea of a uniform society. It shows that even within a structure that emphasized conformity, there were variations in experience. Individuals lived in ways that did not always align with expectations, even when those experiences were not openly recognized. This adds depth to the understanding of the period, revealing layers that are not immediately visible. The records that remain provide only partial insight into these experiences. Many aspects were not documented, either because they were not acknowledged or because they were intentionally concealed. This means that what can be seen is only a fragment of what existed. The absence of direct evidence does not indicate the absence of experience. It reflects the conditions under which those experiences were lived. This creates a sense of distance when looking back at the period. Modern perspectives often rely on clear documentation and open discussion. In contrast, medieval life often placed certain experiences outside the range of what could be openly recorded. This requires a different approach to understanding, one that considers not only what is visible, but also what is suggested through indirect evidence. The individuals who lived through these experiences were part of the same society as everyone else. They were not separate from it. They navigated the same structures, faced the same expectations, and responded to the same pressures. Their experiences were shaped by these conditions even as they moved outside the boundaries that defined acceptable behavior. This perspective highlights the complexity of the Middle Ages. It shows that beneath the appearance of order, there were multiple layers of experience, some visible and others hidden. It reveals how systems of control interact with human behavior, creating outcomes that are not always straightforward. Understanding this helps to create a more complete picture of the period. It moves beyond the idea of a simple uniform society and toward a recognition of its diversity and complexity. It acknowledges that not all experiences fit within the structures that defined them, and that these differences played a role in shaping how life was lived. Relationships outside accepted norms in the Middle Ages were not absent, but pushed into spaces where they could exist quietly, shaped by fear, silence, and constant risk. As these hidden experiences become more visible, they begin to reveal patterns that extend beyond individual cases. A deeper layer reveals how control was not applied equally, but often focused more heavily on certain bodies than others. Observation in the Middle Ages did not fall evenly across society. While rules applied to both men and women, the way those rules were enforced and interpreted often differed. The body of a woman became a focal point for attention, not only in terms of behavior, but also in how that behavior was judged.
This attention was not limited to moments of clear action. It extended into appearance, movement, and reputation, creating a constant awareness that shaped daily life. Responsibility played a central role in this imbalance. Women were closely associated with ideas of honor, legitimacy, and the continuation of family lines. Their bodies were linked to expectations about purity before marriage and fidelity within it. These expectations were not treated as individual concerns. They were connected to the standing of entire families, influencing how relationships were formed and maintained. This connection meant that the consequences of behavior were not experienced in the same way. Actions that involved women could affect not only their own position but also the reputation of those around them. This created a form of pressure that extended beyond the individual. It required constant attention to how one was perceived, reinforcing the importance of maintaining a specific image. Men, while also subject to expectation, often moved within a different set of consequences. Their actions were less directly tied to questions of legitimacy in the same way. This did not mean that behavior was entirely without consequence, but it did mean that the impact was often less immediate or less severe. This difference shaped how behavior was judged and how it was remembered within the community. The result was a system where similar actions could be interpreted in different ways depending on who was involved. A situation that might be treated as a serious violation in one case could be viewed with more leniency in another. This variation was not always explicitly stated in the rules. It emerged through practice, through the way communities responded to events, and through the expectations that guided those responses. Reputation was a key factor in this process. In closely connected communities where information moved quickly and memory persisted, perception played a significant role in shaping outcomes. Women were often judged not only by what they did, but by how their actions were interpreted. This created a situation where appearance and reality could become closely linked, making it difficult to separate one from the other. Control became a way of managing this risk. Families and communities developed methods to monitor behavior, to limit opportunities for situations that might lead to suspicion, and to maintain a level of oversight that reduced uncertainty. These methods were not always presented as restrictions. They were often framed as necessary measures to preserve stability and protect reputation. This constant observation influenced how women understood their own lives. It shaped decisions about movement, interaction, and expression. It created a form of awareness that was present in everyday activity, where choices were made with consideration for how they might be seen by others. This awareness was not limited to moments of significance. It extended into ordinary actions, reflecting the depth of the expectation. The imbalance in observation also reflects broader patterns within medieval society. Systems of control often focused more heavily on certain aspects of life, particularly those connected to inheritance and social order. The body of a woman, tied as it was to these concerns, became a central point of attention. This focus reinforced existing structures, ensuring that expectations were maintained where they were considered most critical. Legal and social responses to behavior further illustrate this pattern. Cases involving women could carry implications that extended beyond the immediate situation, affecting questions of legitimacy and inheritance. This gave those cases additional weight, influencing how they were addressed and remembered. In contrast, similar cases involving men did not always carry the same level of consequence. What emerges from this is not simply a difference in rules, but a difference in perspective. The same behavior could be viewed through different lenses, shaped by expectations that were not evenly distributed. This created a system where judgment was influenced not only by action, but by the identity of the individual involved. This difference can be difficult to fully grasp from a modern perspective, where there is an expectation of more consistent standards. In the Middle Ages, consistency existed within the framework of the system, but that framework itself was uneven. It placed greater emphasis on certain outcomes, and as a result, it directed attention more heavily towards certain individuals. The emotional impact of this imbalance is not always directly recorded, but it can be understood through the conditions it created. Living under constant observation, knowing that perception could shape outcome, would have influenced how individuals experienced their own lives. It would have created a form of pressure that extended beyond specific events, shaping daily existence. This perspective reveals how deeply inequality was embedded within the structure of society. It was not only present in laws or formal rules, it appeared in the way behavior was interpreted, in the way consequences were applied, and in the way individuals were observed.
It was part of how the system functioned. Understanding this helps to clarify how medieval society managed control and expectation. It shows that the system was not neutral. It directed attention and judgment in ways that reinforced existing structures, shaping how individuals moved within those structures. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that this imbalance is part of a larger pattern. Systems that depend on stability often focus control where uncertainty is seen as most threatening. In the Middle Ages, that focus was placed heavily on women's bodies, shaping how they were seen and how they lived. Observation in the Middle Ages did not fall equally, but concentrated more heavily on women, shaping how their actions were judged and remembered within the system. As this imbalance becomes clearer, it begins to connect with the broader structure that defines experience. The next layer reveals how different social classes lived within the same system, yet experienced its pressures in ways that could feel entirely different. Understanding the Middle Ages requires looking beyond the surface that has been carefully preserved through time. At first glance, it appears as a world defined by strict rules, strong religious influence, and a clear sense of moral order. This image suggests restraint, control, and a society where behavior is aligned closely with expectations. But when the details are examined more closely, a different picture begins to emerge, one that reveals not absence but presence shaped by concealment. Human experience did not disappear under the weight of rules. It continued in forms that were sometimes visible and often hidden. Desire existed, relationships formed, and behavior moved in ways that did not always match the structure imposed upon it. These elements were part of daily life. Even when they were not openly acknowledged, the system did not remove them. It surrounded them with language, expectation, and control. The gap between appearance and reality becomes more visible when different aspects of life are considered together. Marriage, shaped by duty and expectation, still contained moments of uncertainty and personal experience. Confession revealed patterns of behavior that did not align with outward appearance. Prostitution existed within systems that both condemned and tolerated it. Illness influenced intimacy in ways that added complexity and risk. Each of these elements shows a layer of reality that extends beyond the surface. This accumulation of layers reveals something important. It shows that the Middle Ages were not defined by a lack of experience, but by the way that experience was managed. Behavior was not absent. It was redirected, controlled, and often hidden. This created a world where what was seen publicly did not fully represent what was lived privately. The role of morality in this process is central. Religious teaching provided a framework that defined what was considered right and wrong. This framework shaped language, guided behavior, and influenced how individuals understood themselves. But it also created a standard that was difficult to meet consistently. The result was not perfect alignment, but ongoing negotiation between expectation and reality. This negotiation can be seen in the way individuals moved between different aspects of their lives. Public behavior reflected what was required to maintain reputation and stability. Private behavior reflected personal experience, shaped by circumstance and desire. These two aspects existed together, creating a balance that was maintained through awareness and adaptation. What makes this particularly striking is how consistent this pattern appears across different areas of life. It is not limited to a single context. It appears in relationships, in institutions, and in everyday interactions. It reflects a broader dynamic where systems of control interact with human behavior, producing outcomes that are layered and complex. The presence of concealment does not mean that individuals were unaware of what was happening. In many cases, there was a shared understanding that extended beyond what was openly discussed. Communities developed ways of recognizing behavior without directly acknowledging it, allowing certain realities to exist without disrupting visible order. This created a form of collective awareness that operated beneath the surface. This awareness contributed to the stability of the system by allowing behavior to exist in controlled or hidden forms. Society could maintain its outward structure while accommodating the realities of human experience. This did not resolve the tension between rule and behavior. It managed it, creating a balance that could be sustained over time. The idea of a completely closed or repressed society becomes difficult to maintain when these layers are considered. The Middle Ages were not defined by silence alone. They were defined by the interaction between silence and expression, between what was allowed and what was concealed. This interaction shaped how life was experienced and understood. Looking at this pattern more closely also reveals how perception influences historical understanding. When only the visible structure is considered, the image appears simple and controlled. When the hidden layers are included, the picture becomes more detailed and more complex. It shows a society that was not static, but constantly adjusting to the interaction between rule and reality. The concept of honesty becomes central in this context. It is not that individuals lacked awareness of their own behavior. It is that the system did not allow for open acknowledgement of that behavior. In many cases, this created a situation where truth existed, but it was expressed indirectly or contained within specific settings. It shaped how individuals communicated and how they understood themselves. This perspective changes how the Middle Ages can be viewed. It moves away from a simplified image of restriction and toward a recognition of complexity. It shows that beneath the surface of order, there was a continuous presence of human experience that did not always align with expectation. This presence is what gives the period its depth. The more closely these elements are considered, the clearer it becomes that the Middle Ages were not defined by absence but by contradiction. Rules and behavior existed together, influencing each other in ways that created a layered reality. This reality is not immediately visible, but it becomes clearer through careful examination. The Middle Ages did not lack desire, adultery, prostitution, fear, pleasure, coercion, or secrecy, but gathered all of them beneath a surface that appeared morally stable and controlled. As that surface begins to crack, it exposes how much of life was never truly absent, only carefully hidden. Another layer reveals how the image of a completely closed and restrained era breaks apart once these hidden realities are brought into view. Social class in the Middle Ages shaped nearly every part of life, and intimacy was no exception. It was not experienced in the same way across society. Instead, it was deeply influenced by the conditions in which people lived, the expectations placed upon them, and the pressures that defined their roles. Two individuals could exist in the same time under the same broad system of rules, yet experience intimacy in ways that felt entirely different. Among the nobility, intimacy was closely tied to responsibility. Marriage was rarely a personal decision. It was arranged to secure alliances, strengthen political ties, and preserve family power. The union of two individuals represented more than a relationship. It was part of a larger strategy, one that connected families and shaped the structure of authority. This gave intimacy a specific purpose, one that extended beyond personal experience. The expectation to produce heirs was central to this purpose. A noble marriage was not complete without children, particularly sons who could continue the family line. This expectation created pressure that influenced how intimacy was approached. It was not simply a matter of personal connection. It was a necessary step in maintaining status and ensuring continuity. The absence of children could lead to uncertainty, tension, and in some cases the breakdown of the marriage itself. Reputation added another layer to this experience. Noble families were highly visible, and their actions were closely observed. Behavior within marriage as well as outside it could affect not only individuals but entire family lines. This created a need to maintain a certain image, reinforcing the importance of control and discretion. Intimacy, even in its most private form, was shaped by the awareness that its consequences could extend far beyond the individuals involved. Despite this structure, personal experience did not disappear. Desire, uncertainty, and individual feelings still existed, but these elements were often secondary to the expectations placed upon the marriage. They had to fit within a framework that prioritized stability and continuity. This created a situation where personal experience was influenced and sometimes limited by the broader goals of the family. In contrast, the experience of those in lower social classes was shaped by very different conditions. For many, daily life was defined by labor, limited resources, and shared living spaces. These conditions influenced how relationships formed and how intimacy was experienced. The absence of formal arrangements in some cases allowed for more personal choice, but this did not necessarily lead to greater freedom. Economic pressure played a significant role. Survival often depended on work that was physically demanding and time-consuming. This left little space for moments that could be separated from daily necessity. Intimacy existed within the same environment as labor, shaped by the same constraints and limitations. It was not removed from the realities of life, it was part of them. Living conditions further influenced this experience. Crowded spaces, shared rooms, and limited privacy created an environment where personal moments were difficult to isolate. This made intimacy more direct but also more exposed to the presence of others. The lack of separation between different aspects of life reinforced the idea that intimacy was not a distinct experience but one integrated into daily routine.
Vulnerability was also more pronounced in these conditions. Limited access to resources, exposure to illness, and the absence of protection from social or legal consequences created risks that were difficult to manage. Relationships could form more freely in some cases, but they also carried consequences that could be immediate and severe. This created a balance between opportunity and risk that shaped how individuals approached their own experiences. The contrast between these two experiences highlights how the same system could produce different outcomes depending on position within it. For the nobility, intimacy was structured by obligation and expectation, tied to long-term goals and family strategy. For the poor, it was shaped by immediate conditions, influenced by environment and necessity. Both experiences existed within the same society, yet they reflected very different realities. What remains consistent across these differences is the influence of external factors. In both cases, intimacy was not entirely free from structure. It was shaped by forces that extended beyond the individual, whether those forces came from family expectations, economic conditions, or social norms. This limited the extent to which personal experience could exist independently. The presence of these differences also reveals the complexity of medieval society. It was not uniform. It contained variations that reflected the diversity of experience within it. Understanding these variations helps to create a more complete picture, one that acknowledges both the shared structure and the different ways it was lived. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that social class did not simply influence experience. It defined it. It determined what was expected, what was possible, and what was at risk. It shaped how individuals understood their own lives and how they moved within the system that surrounded them. This perspective challenges the idea of a single narrative. It shows that there is no one way to describe intimacy in the Middle Ages. There are multiple experiences, each shaped by different conditions and expectations. These experiences intersect, but they do not merge into a single uniform reality. The result is a layered understanding of the period, one that reflects both structure and variation. It reveals how individuals lived within a system that influenced them in different ways, creating outcomes that were shaped by both shared rules and individual circumstances.
Intimacy in the Middle Ages was not experienced in the same way by everyone, but was shaped by social class in ways that created entirely different realities within the same world. As these differences become clearer, they begin to reveal how modern assumptions can simplify a far more complex past. Another layer reveals how misunderstanding this complexity leads to the belief that people of that time were either naive or extreme, when in reality they existed somewhere in between. Modern imagination often places the Middle Ages at one of two extremes. On one side there is the idea of innocence, a world where people were unaware, restrained, and distant from physical experience. On the other hand, there is the opposite image, one of excess, where behavior is imagined as uncontrolled and driven entirely by impulse. These two views appear very different, yet they share the same problem. Both reduce a complex reality into something simple and easy to understand. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that neither of these images fully reflects what life was like. People in the Middle Ages did not exist at one extreme or the other. They lived within a system that shaped their understanding of themselves, but they were not defined entirely by that system. Their experiences contained contradictions, where belief and behavior did not always align in a consistent way. Religious teaching played a central role in shaping how individuals understood right and wrong. It defined boundaries, provided language for judgment, and created a framework through which behavior could be evaluated. People were aware of these expectations. They understood the idea of sin, and they recognized when their actions did not align with what was considered acceptable. This awareness was part of daily life, influencing how individuals thought about themselves and their choices. At the same time, awareness did not prevent behavior. Desire remained present, shaped by the same human impulses that exist in any period. Individuals experienced attraction, curiosity, and need, even when those experiences conflicted with what they had been taught. This created a situation where belief and behavior existed side by side, not always in harmony. This coexistence produced a form of internal tension. Individuals did not simply ignore the expectations placed upon them, nor did they always follow them completely. They moved between these two positions, adjusting their behavior depending on circumstances. At times, they followed the rules closely. At other times, they acted in ways that went beyond those boundaries. This movement was not unusual. It was part of how life was lived. Fear also played a role in shaping this dynamic. The consequences of behavior could be significant, affecting reputation, relationships, and standing within the community.
This created a need to manage actions carefully, to consider not only what one wanted, but also what might happen if those desires became visible. Fear did not remove desire, but it influenced how it was expressed. This influence led to the development of strategies for navigating the system. Individuals learned how to adapt, how to move within expectations while still responding to their own experiences. This could involve secrecy, silence, or indirect expression. It could also involve moments of conformity where behavior aligned with expectation to maintain stability. These strategies allowed individuals to live within the system without being entirely defined by it. What emerges from this is not a picture of simplicity, but one of complexity. People were not entirely obedient, nor were they entirely uncontrolled. They existed in a space between these extremes, shaped by both structure and impulse. This space is where much of their experience took place, and it is what gives the period its depth. The idea of contradiction becomes central to understanding this reality. Individuals could believe in the importance of moral order while still acting in ways that challenged it. They could feel guilt and continue the behavior at the same time. They could seek to follow expectations while also finding ways around them. These contradictions were not exceptions. They were part of the normal experience. This perspective challenges the tendency to simplify the past. It shows that people were not fundamentally different in terms of how they experienced desire, fear, and decision-making. What differed was the structure in which these experiences occurred and the way that structure shaped how they were expressed. The presence of contradiction also explains why the subject can feel both uncomfortable and compelling. It reflects a reality that is not easily categorized, one that resists simple explanation. It reveals a world where clarity is difficult to maintain, where behavior and belief interact in ways that are not always predictable. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that this complexity is not unique to the Middle Ages. It is a feature of human experience more generally. Systems of belief and expectation interact with individual behavior in ways that produce outcomes that are layered and often contradictory. The Middle Ages provide a clear example of this interaction, making it easier to observe. Understanding this helps to shift the focus away from extremes and toward a more balanced view. It recognizes that individuals live within a system that influences them but does not fully determine their behavior. It acknowledges the presence of both structure and variation, showing how they work together to shape experience. This approach creates a more accurate picture of the period. It avoids reducing it to a single narrative and instead allows for the presence of multiple perspectives. It reflects the reality that life was shaped by a combination of factors, each contributing to how individuals understood and experienced their own lives. The result is a view that feels both distant and familiar. Distant because the structures and expectations are different. Familiar because the patterns of contradiction, adaptation, and negotiation remain recognizable. It reveals how the past is not entirely separate from the present, but connected through shared aspects of human experience. People in the Middle Ages were neither purely innocent nor entirely uncontrolled, but lived within a constant tension between belief and desire that shaped how they experienced the world. As this tension becomes clearer, it begins to bring the entire picture into focus. A final layer reveals how all of these elements, when seen together, lead to a deeper understanding of what this period truly represents. Looking back at the Middle Ages with all its layers revealed, it becomes clear that intimacy was never a simple or isolated part of life. It was shaped by forces that extended far beyond individual feeling. Religion defined what was acceptable. Property determined what was valuable. Bloodlines decided what mattered most. Law enforced boundaries, and fear ensured that those boundaries were rarely ignored for long. These forces did not exist separately. They overlapped, forming a structure that surrounded every personal experience. Within this structure, intimacy could not stand alone. It was connected to expectations that reached into every corner of life. A marriage was not only a relationship, it was an arrangement tied to inheritance and stability. A body was not only personal, it was linked to reputation and control. Even moments that might seem private were influenced by rules that came from outside the individuals involved. This connection is what shaped how intimacy was experienced. The idea that medieval life was either innocent or extreme does not hold when these details are considered together. What appears instead is something more complex. People were aware of what was expected of them, and they often believed in those expectations. At the same time, they experienced desires, fears, and impulses that did not always align with those expectations. This created a constant tension, one that influenced how they lived and how they understood themselves. That tension did not disappear. It became part of daily life. Individuals learned to move within it, adjusting their behavior depending on circumstance. They followed rules when it was necessary, avoided attention when it was possible, and found ways to continue living within a system that could not fully contain their experience. This was not a rare situation. It was a pattern that appeared again and again. The presence of this pattern shows that human behavior does not change as easily as systems might suggest. Rules can guide actions, but they do not remove impulse. Structures can shape experience, but they do not eliminate complexity. The Middle Ages provide a clear example of this interaction where control and behavior existed together, influencing each other without fully resolving their differences. What makes this realization important is how it changes the way the past is understood. It moves away from the idea of distance, from the belief that people in another time were fundamentally different. Instead, it reveals something familiar. The same elements that shape human experience today were present then, though they existed within a different framework. Desire, fear, responsibility, and contradiction were all part of life. They did not disappear because of the rules. Those elements were shaped by those rules, redirected by them, and sometimes hidden beneath them. This does not make the Middle Ages unique. It makes them recognizable in a different way, showing how similar patterns can exist across different conditions. The difference lies in the structure. Modern life offers forms of freedom that did not exist in the same way during the Middle Ages. Knowledge has changed, systems have evolved, and expectations have shifted. But the underlying elements of human experience remain consistent. This is what creates the connection between past and present. Understanding this connection does not remove the distance entirely. The Middle Ages were shaped by conditions that were often more restrictive, more uncertain, and more difficult to navigate. The lack of medical knowledge, the strength of religious authority, and the importance of social hierarchy all contributed to a world that could feel harsher and less forgiving. These conditions influenced how people lived and how they understood their own lives. At the same time, those conditions did not erase what made them human. They did not remove desire or eliminate contradiction. They created a different environment in which those elements existed. This is what gives the period its depth, showing how human experience adapts to different structures without losing its core characteristics. Looking at the Middle Ages in this way changes how the entire subject can be approached. It becomes less about judging the past and more about understanding it. It reveals a world that is complex, layered, and shaped by the interaction between system and individual. It shows how people lived within that interaction, navigating it in ways that were not always visible. This perspective also invites reflection on the present. It raises questions about how current systems shape behavior, how expectations influence experience, and how much of what is visible reflects what is actually lived. It suggests that the gap between appearance and reality is not unique to one period, but part of a broader pattern that continues over time. The Middle Ages, when viewed through this lens, are not distant in the way they might first appear. They are connected to familiar patterns, expressed in a different context. This connection does not reduce their complexity. It makes it easier to recognize the elements that define them. The lesson that emerges is not that the past was strange, but that it was structured in a way that shaped familiar human experiences into unfamiliar forms. It shows how power, belief, and fear can define how life is lived without removing the impulses that drive it. It reveals that history is not a story of different people, but of the same patterns unfolding under different conditions. As this journey through the Middle Ages comes to a close, the details that once seemed distant begin to settle into a clearer shape. The crowded rooms, the quiet tensions, the unspoken rules, and the hidden lives all come together into a single picture. It is not a picture of silence or absence, but one of presence shaped by constraint. Now, as you step away from this world, allow the weight of these details to soften. Let the structure fade, and let the quiet understanding remain. The past does not need to stay sharp or distant. It can rest gently in the background, offering its perspective without demanding attention. Take a moment to relax your thoughts, to let them slow down, and to leave behind the layers that have been uncovered. The stories of the past can remain where they belong while you return to your own space, free from the constraints that shape them. Good night, and may your rest be calm, steady, and undisturbed.
Good night, sweet dreams.